Thing.
Rolling.
Okay, Carey, we're really interested in the legend of Samoana. We realise that you sort of came a little bit later
Yes.
than when they were playing, but for you, being involved with the rugby league in Otago, what is this legend?
It goes back a long way, as you say. It first began 1964. That's the establishment year of Samoana. Now, what actually happened was, I don't know the full story about who got what organised. I do know that Lulu Lomi was one of the big ones that, in terms of actually getting the people together. He must have heard wind that there were at the time Samoan students coming to Dunedin and studying, and I suppose as a result of the university meeting at the church, would have been a social meeting point of view. That's when they would have then started to congregate, and he would have then mooted the idea of playing league in Dunedin. I must say, at that stage too, Lomi had actually played league for the Athletic Rugby League Club for a few years. So he was the first Samoan effectively to play league in Dunedin. So as a result, he thought, well, here's a good game. I've enjoyed it. I've been playing for a few years, but I want to get my people involved in playing the game. And I understand how it all began. So that's when the establishment of the club began, and it all started to take shape there. And in the first year, they showed a brand of league which had never been played in Dunedin before. It was fast moving. You've got to remember then, league was very different to the way it is now. They didn't have the 10-metre rulings. It was only 3 yards between the team. You didn't have the 6 tackle rules. It was unlimited tackles. So it was very much in your face. But even so, despite that, Samoans still played it at a fast pace. They played it at an exciting pace. And so they just swept all teams aside in 1964, in their very first year, and they qualified. It was then the Rothmans tournament. It was the £500 tournament. Sorry, £1,000. A lot of money, £1,000 back in '64. And so they went up to play in Christchurch to hopefully get the £1,000. Which I can't remember who the Christchurch club was, but unfortunately lost on the occasion. And that's where it all began. And then it continued right through to 1967.
Yes, yeah. And later on, when you came along, was there still ramifications from this team, as in, people still talking about it?
Well, very much so. I got into rugby league totally by accident, and it's an interesting thing. I went down to Dunedin to work on the Otago Daily Times as a reporter, and when I was a reporter on there, I kept seeing rugby league, the draw on the paper, and there was rugby league, but there was no coverage. And I remember saying to our sports editor, Brent Edwards, at the time, why isn't rugby league covered? And his words were, well, we don't want to cover a sport like that. And I asked him, well, what is it? He said, oh, it's just for fighting, and it's not a good game. I said, well, how about if I go out and cover a game and see what it's like? Oh, you can do what you like, I'm not going to stop you. Anyway, I liked the style of play, people were very welcoming to me, but Brent's very brief comments were very typical, because at that stage, I was playing rugby union for Pirates, and again talked about league, and they only, I don't know whether it was the white middle class or what the thought was at that stage, but they saw league as only ruffians and only forward brawls and that sort of thing. And I guess that stigma, the legends from that time, particularly that very bad year of 1967, which got nothing but negative headlines, which you've seen, it's stuck in people's memories ever since, and it's just gone through that mentality. I don't know whether it's the Conservative Society of Dunedin that was doing that, or what the story was.
And what was Dunedin like back then? What do you think?
In the 1960s?
When they first came to the...
Well, it was at that stage, it was a university town as it is today, but it was mainly a white town. There were Māori that were there. Of course, you had the Otakau Marae out there, so there were Māori, but there were very, very few Pacific Islanders at that stage. So they were going into unknown territory at that stage from a demographic point of view. So there must have been a bit of a culture shock, the climate, all sorts of things for them. I guess there must have been something, though, that they liked down there. I'm not sure whether it was the university or whether it was the employment or whatever. I can't speak for them as far as that's concerned. But obviously, some families, once they graduated, or not all of them that went down there, I might add, went down there to study. Some of them did go down there to work. But some of them obviously enjoyed it as a means of escape, or not shouldn't use escape, but a means of pulling up and trying somewhere new. And they obviously enjoyed it to the extent where some of those families are still down there today, and they've done well for themselves. They're very well established families down there.
And are there any names in particular that stand out for you from the teams?
Oh, there've been some real leaders there. I mean, you had soon to be Mātais in the down there. I mean, Whalima Lamalu is now Mātai, who goes under Lamalu, for example. Atamata Matua, who was not only a good league player, and he was an original Samoana player, he was also a very, very good cricketer. In fact, played cricket for Otago. He may have been the first Samoan to play cricket for Otago. At that stage, he was playing Plunkett Shield and played for this. And interestingly, he and Peter Tuama were both members of the senior university cricket team together. So you had those figures. You had other figures that also had leadership roles as well. One, I don't think he played for Samoa, he soon played for university though, was Tole Fua. And Tala later became the speaker in the Samoan Parliament. He was a High Commissioner in Brussels. He edited Samoa Today. So he's done a lot. He's back in Samoa now. So you had some people that became very big leadership figures later on.
And what about in Dunedin itself? As you say, some of these players, after the team was disbanded, went on to play for Otago or simultaneously played in other teams. What effect did they have there?
I think they added a little bit of variety to this team. And that's good. They brought their own skills that you wouldn't necessarily see with other type of players. Tole Fua, for example, was renowned for having the biggest sidestep. I mean, he should have been a Kiwi. In fact, there's an interesting story that he was set to go with the New Zealand Under-23 tournament, New Zealand Under-23 team to Australia in '69, but because he was under a scholarship from the Samoan government at the time, they would not release him to go on that tour to play for New Zealand Under-23. So he came close to Kiwis, and within a year or two he went to Union and actually became only the second player ever, following Graham McCowie, to play rugby league for Otago first, and then played for the Otago Rugby Union team. And of course in those days that was unheard of, because anybody that played league had to stand down and swear by the Bible and all sorts of dispensations. Some of them never were allowed to play rugby union because it was a professional game, even though league in Otago always, it has been, largely amateur.
And what about this bad reputation of fighting and brawling?
Well, again, looking at the newspaper clips, there have been, it's hard to weigh it up without actually having been a witness at first hand who were the instigators. But if you look at the newspapers, yes, it's very negative, the headlines say it all, but if you look at it, it's not just Samoana that were involved in the brawling or started off in the brawling. Celtic were very passionate. See, rugby league have very passionate people, and that's sometimes where passion overrides things. And even today in other sports you hear sideline calls and abuse and so on. So it really stems from particular passion and wanting to see teams win. In the case of Samoana, early examples were the fact that they had a lot of their women supporters, whether it was girlfriends or mothers or aunts or whatever, that used to come along and support them. And sometimes it wasn't just the players that actually got involved in the brawling. Actually, the late Jack Fairley spent a couple of days in hospital because at the end of the game he was hit over the head with some umbrellas and sideline sticks because the result
by the women.
Because the result did not go in favour of the Samoana side that day. So they, one or two players have told me that as well as Samoana played as a team, there were superb players. So when they won, they went well, they partied well, and they celebrated well. But when they lost, my goodness me, they weren't very good at losing. In other words, they weren't sometimes gracious losers. But I suspect it was not so much the players that were the ungracious losers. It was more their supporters than anybody else that did that. But again, Kyoto got involved in brawls. City got involved in brawls. So to single out someone, I think, is a little unfair in some ways. But I guess when you look at the reports, invariably it seems to be the more brawls than ever seem to be involving Samoana. But interestingly, Samoana B, because Samoana had both an A and a B side, and so I suspect the B side may have been a little less disciplined, shall we say, anyway, in its approach. Yeah.
Great.
So that whole period of where they won the championship every year, how do you think that was received by everyone? Was there a lot of support for them with the other teams? Just trying to gauge how that whole atmosphere...
Yeah.
Coming out of nowhere to win it every year must have been quite...
Well, I know probably from a Celtic point of view, they would have been particularly disappointed because they brought down John Walsh, who was a Kiwi selected for the Kiwis in '65. He came down from Christchurch. And Celtic at that stage were renowned as the best organised club off the field. They even were one of the only clubs, I think, that had their own club rooms, even though it was only above a garage and things like that, and it wasn't anything flash like you see in the rugby clubs. So they were doing very well from a business perspective, and they brought in money and so on. They used to have gambling nights. I can go into those sort of things at some other stage. So in saying that, because they felt that they were most organised off the field, but then they couldn't match the results on the field, they won the championship, I might say, in '65. So Samoana didn't actually win all the championships. So Celtic won it in '65, but then Samoana came back and won in '66 and '67 before they finished up that year. So the rivalry was a team that was magnificent in its field. On the field, it's just Samoana versus a team that was magnificent off the field in terms of organisation and preparation. That's not to say Celtic was bad on the field. It's just that they lacked that little factor, whatever they call it, X factor, that Samoana had in it.
So they were generally the top two teams in that period.
Yeah, pretty much so. University were also very good in the mid-'60s, but they really didn't start to develop their own until later on in the late '60s. And ironically, part of that evolution, why University started to do well from around '68 onwards, was they actually had some of the Samoana players come over and start to play for University. So whether you say that's coincidence and whether that was the reason, well, that's not for me to judge. But I mean, you can draw your own conclusions as a result, when you see the results.
What do you think the effect of having a team like this, what it did for the profile of Samoans and Islanders in Dunedin itself, generally?
Well, it certainly gave there's no doubt it lifted the profile to say that the Samoans are in town and they are playing league. However, the negative publicity, I think, really had an opposite effect in some ways. So it had a good effect from giving a profile to say that, yes, there's some exciting games, but with the amount of brawls, particularly, again, back to that bad year in '67, that again had a bad stigma, and I think for so long, as a result, once the club folded, I think that's where I don't think there was ever anything said whether it was an unwritten rule, but it was like those that went away to the Second World War or the First World War. When they came back, they never spoke about their battles to their children and their grandchildren. It was just something, and it was like Samoana had been to war almost, and for their generations that followed, they just never wanted to discuss it. It was whether it was a shameful period in their history. Only they can tell you that. As far as, again, you can draw your conclusions. But it seems to me, yes, they are proud to talk about it, but it's only really when you sit down and really try to talk to them about it. But for some, they didn't mention, sadly, to their children for more than 30, 40 years after the events. So, it's only started to come out now that those games occurred.
And from your perspective, what was the reasons for Samoana folding?
I think in the end, the Otago Rugby League board, it was led by a person called George Stewart, who was an RSM in the army for many years. George, who I knew, was a very straightforward character who didn't stand for any nonsense. George wanted to see the game succeed. He became a life member of Otago Rugby League, but George didn't stand for any nonsense. He was a very straight-driven sort of man, and the only way he could see league getting back on board and getting rid of this image trouble that it had in '67 was to disband the Samoana club, and that indeed proved the case. So I think pressure from the Otago Rugby League Board of Control, from the publicity, I think the Samoana players themselves probably felt that they had done their run, that they had their 3 or 4 years of glory, that they'd won the championship. Some of them were about to graduate and move back to Samoa or different parts of New Zealand. So I think there were a number of different factors to why it disbanded. Others may have just lost complete interest in the league as well. They might have decided to go and start playing rugby union or some other code. So I don't think there was one particular contributing factor. There was a number of factors behind it.
Now, if you look at league today, I mean, there's so many Islanders that play. They're like 40% of the NRL. How do you, and no one knows about this story. What do you think is the importance of people knowing about a team like Samoana, and how do you relate the game and the numbers of Islanders then and now, and how they're really quite a standout?
And even the style of play as well,
yeah.
It was.
Well, it's by the seat of your pants style. That's the way Pacific Islanders are renowned. They like to play the fast play, and sometimes that is it's frustrating from a coach's point of view. It can either win you games or it can lose you games. You could have many turnovers by doing not hospital passes, but pied passes that go between gaps and nobody's there to receive it. But at the same time, if it's a gambler, it's like they're playing a game of it's a gamble game they have on the field. That sometimes it pays off and sometimes it doesn't pay off. It's like watching a game of touch. It's a very fast style, but at the same time, it will work. Sometimes it won't work. Sometimes. Do they have the cool heads as Palangis, Pākehās, Europeans, whatever you want to call them? Again, it's hard to know because, remember, it's very different to being on the field to watching the game. You can only judge these sort of things. You can train. Are they good trainers? I mean, there's been criticism to say that they are lazy trainers. I don't know. I mean, the person that played Jerry Searseer, his uncle, Fali Searseer, played for Samoana, so it's actually had an effect there. Even at the Warriors level. Again, those families of some of those Samoana players went on to play league. a couple of them, Damien and Ray Whittiel. Their father, Frank Whittiel, played for Samoana. Danny Tamari's father, Danny Senior, played league for Otago as well. So again, and the interesting thing is that for some of those families, again, they started playing league without even knowing that their fathers had played league beforehand. So there's a whole lot of different things. It's quite a complicated thing at the end of the day. There's no set answer for those sort of things.
Were there a lot of Islanders generally across the country at that time playing league?
Well,
like the Rockman's Cup? Or?
Yeah, I can't really say because I really didn't know too much about the other provinces. I know there were pockets of Islanders in certain communities, especially up here in Auckland, but I don't know about, I can't really say for Christchurch or Wellington. I suppose there might have been, but again, you've got to look at the migration and what brought Samoans to different communities. Was it employment? Was it the university? It could have been both, or it could have been because there were families down here that they wanted to move down to. Who knows?
And what's the most fascinating thing about the team for you?
I think, there's many different things about the thing. It was a very interesting period, and you've got to also look at the history that was going through the world at the time. I mean, Vietnam was happening, so it was quite an interesting time in our history in New Zealand. It was a time of change. The younger generation. This is the time you've got to remember the baby boomers were starting to now take control. You know, those who were born after the Second World War. So they were starting to have a bit of an impact on. They wanted to do things different. I might add, by the way, that one thing about Samoana, and looking at the photographs, the image they must have carried was always a good one, because when you look at them and the officials, they're always in suit and ties, they're always in the short back and sides. You don't see anything with the huge long hairdos or the Rastafarian style haircuts that they have today.
And it was that period of the 60s when they...
It was a more conservative society. Because, I mean, they again would have been taught these values by their parents, and the parents were of that values. So again, but there was at the same time at that mid-60s period, there's also a bit of a rebelling period in our society in New Zealand, you know, and because of the likes of Vietnam. So again, if you put those factors into consideration, it's a point in time where things were starting to evolve, were starting to happen for the very first time. So I guess from my perspective, in looking at it, it would have been an interesting time because it was evolutionary. It was something completely new, and it was going to impact on our society. And really, they were the pioneers that started it all.
Original warriors, maybe.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's one way you could put it. Yeah, they were going in, you know, and to use the phrase from Star Trek, you know, to go where no man has gone before, to go where no Samoan has gone before, sort of thing.
Do you know if they had any sort of support from Samoa or Samoan organisations, apart from the church maybe, or government?
Well, they certainly got the government scholarships for those that were the university ones to come here. But again, I don't know under the scholarships whether they may have played league. You see, one thing also back in those days, in Dunedin especially, was that some of them played under aliases because rugby league was played on Sundays. So they might have been playing league, although they've got them in the newspapers. Some of them may have played under alias names, like John Smith or something like that might have been playing. There's about 5 John Smiths playing in the one team. So there was that period in time when, again, under the scholarships, it might have said you can't play league, but again, there would have been a little bit of rebellion to say, well, we enjoy the style of play, we're going to try playing it, but you know, we'll have to just tread lightly, otherwise we'll lose our scholarship or something like that.
Great. Anything else? Is there anything else you'd like to add about the team and how it's contributed to Otago Rugby League and its
Well, I think
colourful history.
Well, I think it was a start. It was an evolution at a time in the league in Otago. It was the start of something new that was to have an effect maybe 30 or so years later, as I say, with the generations of the sons and so on that followed into the game. At the time, it was unknown. It really was going through a time when people didn't know how to quite view it properly. It's sad that, of course, that the club went into extinction. From my perspective, I would have loved to see the Samoana club still go. I mean, it would be over 50 years. This year's marks, interesting, the 50th anniversary year since the Samoana club, when you think of it. This year in 64.
And to make two teams, A and B, when it was 13 aside back then, so there was a good amount of players around.
Yeah, but you have to remember too, they didn't have 17 in a squad. They had 15. They only had 2 subs, and in those days you could only be subbed on only if there was a genuine injury. So if somebody actually broke a leg, you could actually be subbed on. But if you pulled a hammy, you were supposed to continue on playing for the rest of the game. So again, the whole difference game. I suspect also one thing I might address too is that the refereeing, I don't think, was of a good standard back in those days. I know it's a bit sad to say that again without seeing it, but the impressions, the things I can read between the lines is that I get the feeling just the referees just didn't quite have the correct control of the games. They weren't forceful enough when what they should have been doing was either binning or sending players off very early in the game, and that would have had the discipline of both the teams on the field. But I suspect whenever Samoana played or whenever there were other teams, there was always tension in the air, and it just festered until it came to a climax in a particular game, and then that's when it all started with the all-in brawls and so on, and that's when, of course, it created the headline. So all these things had snowball effects at the end of the day.
Great. Okay. Yeah, that's, I think, pretty much got most things. Is there anything else you can
no, as I say, I just think, I just hope, and I hope history will record that the Samoana people that did play for the club were good people. I don't want people to think that they were terrible people that went out of their way to deliberately maim the players on the field, although it seems it was sort of you look after your mates sort of thing. So when there were these things that happened, it might have started off as a one-on-one, but then they were there to rescue the others. I might add, though, there were some heroic stuff, and Peter Tuama in particular is one person that does stand out for his heroics. Peter may not tell the story, although he has told it to me personally. Jack Fairley, we'll go back to the late Jack Fairley. Now, when he was attacked in a game around about 64-65 by the Samoan ladies, it was Peter that actually came to the rescue by literally laying on the top of Jack, and Peter, as a result, can show you some of the scars that he's got today by being attacked by his own people, and as a result of trying to save Jack. I mean, if there was such a thing as a civilian VC for something that Peter should have had a bravery award done that day. So there were some people of good intentions there, and I think it's sad, that those things like that have never been recorded, and I think it's time now, 50 years on, that the record is put straight. I think those people that played for Samoana who are still around shouldn't be disgraced at all. I think they should be looking at themselves and saying, we're the pioneers, we're very proud of what we achieved, and now's the time to say, yes, I'm going to tell my side of the story. Because up until then there'd been some sort of gentleman's agreement with them to say, we don't want to sort of say anything.